All right, chapter 14, late medieval Italy. All right, this is going to be from 1200 to 1400 CE, and it's going to be broken down into two main time periods. From 1200 to 1300 called the Duecento, and then from 1301 to 1400 called the Trecento. And then whenever we get into the Quattrocento, which is from 1401 to 1500, that's going to be the actual Renaissance period. And that's covered in Art 142. All right, so we'll end with Western art in chapter 14 just prior to the Renaissance. And then from there, we're going to go into other pockets of the world and see what's been going on while the Western art has been advancing during this time. So this is the last of medieval, the late medieval Italy. It's the last of the medieval time, post-Gothic period, and it's also the kind of the belling in or the resonating of Renaissance, sometimes called Proto-Renaissance. So that's Proto, and Renaissance is Renaissance. So this late medieval Italy is sometimes known as the Proto-Renaissance, or like just before the Renaissance began. So we'll begin with the Duecento, which is again 1201 to 1300, and that's spelled Duecento. Now, forgive me if I look down at my notes a lot because there's a lot of Italian words that are being used. That's going to require me to make sure that I spell it out for you. Girl boss, spell it out to you properly. All right. So the medieval time, if you remember in the last conversation we had with the Gothic period, is a time of emotion. All right, it's a time of reveling in emotions to show connection to biblical stories through emotional presentation. And now we're going to we're still going to be seeing that, but we're going to be moving into more of a rational and more of a humanistic, naturalistic approach, imbibing the spirit of science and mathematics into these biblical themes. So they're still going to be there, but it's going to be more of a logical, rational approach to worshiping God and in this Judeo-Christian mindset. And they're going to bring back Greco-Roman or Greek and Roman techniques and styles to emphasize the importance of this level of humanism and naturalism. So medieval is actually considered a distortion of the noble Greek and Roman period that we looked at in chapter 7 and in chapter 6, and also in chapter 5 and some of chapter 4. I don't think we really talked about chapter 4. That's the Etruscan. Just wait. No, that's the Aegean. Chapter 4 was the Aegean, just before Greece. Chapter 6 was the Etruscan, just before the Roman, which was chapter 7. So I mixed 4 and 6 into the Greco-Roman discussion in the video, so they're already there. So there's going to be two main things happening during this Duecento, or the 13th century, and that is, of course, sculpture and painting. Just a little more context. Frederick II of Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire, which we've talked about, which is the residual remnants of the Roman Empire under Holy Orthodox Christian rule, is going to increase classical art like what Charlemagne did when we looked at the artwork in Europe, the Northern European artwork. And we talked about Charlemagne, and we talked about the Anglo-Saxons, the Hiberno-Saxons, the Vikings. We also talked about the Ottonians, and it was during that Ottonian period that Charlemagne came to be and reintroduced the thematic concepts of artistic connection to a Roman emperor. They literally saw themselves as an extension of the previous Roman emperors, and that was under Charlemagne. So the Holy Roman Empire, of course, which is actually presently in Germany and Belgium at this time during the 13th century. It's not. Some of it's in Italy, but most of it is up in Germany and Belgium. as well as Sicily, the island that's off the tip of Italy, are going to be huge in increasing the importance of classical art during this time. A few things about sculpture, and then what we'll do is we'll jump into the PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint will begin on figure 14.2. We're going to talk about Pisano, Pisano, right, in the pulpit of the baptistry in Pisa, Italy. So this is what's going on with sculpture during this time. They're going to be clustering figures to show depth, and that's something that we saw even in antiquity, right, in the Byzantine time. So they're going to be clustering to show depth. So they're not going to focus on trying to actually depict realistically what depth looks like to our eyes whenever we look upon depth, either in downtown Yuma, down the street, across campus, at the ocean in San Diego, or down in Tijuana, wherever we're casting our eyes out into the ocean. Not what we empirically actually see with our eyes. They're going to be clustering depth based off of the figures, and we're going to see that in Pisano's piece here in just a second. There's going to be, again, that emphasis of organic drapery. They're going to want to be bringing that back. Now, one thing that was really big about drapery during this medieval time was it was more for patterning and less about actually what the body looked like underneath the drapery. It was more about kind of emotional angles and patterns to give a sense of energy, and using it more as a linear device within the representation of the figures wearing their robes, but not the organic drapery. The organic drapery is more of an emphasis on what the body is actually doing underneath the drapery to make the drapery move. That's what the organic drapery will be. So they're going to start bringing that back. Also, they're going to use the Corinthian pillars, which was a huge staple during the Hellenistic period, right, when Alexander the Great was in rule of the Macedonian kingdom. So we're going to be having the Corinthian pillars come back. There's going to be the use of that arcade, which again is that sequence of arches, barrel arches side by side to create pattern and structure all the way down the architecture. So the arcades are going to come back. And there's also going to be the sprung barrel vaults, so those old barrel vaults. But within those barrel vaults, which we'll see with Pisano, there's going to be more intricate detail, which is coming out from the Gothic period. The Gothic period was a heavily ornate period of visual display of architecture, and that's going to become very prominent during that period, in Gothic period, with chapter 13. And we're going to see some remnants of that here in chapter 14 as well. And the use of the frieze, all right, that's going to come back. So now let's take a look at figure 14.2. This is Pisano's pulpit of the baptistry, not baptistry, baptistry. And it's going to show all of the things that I just discussed, but with biblical orthodox scenes, all right? And let me see here, faces. Oh, and a couple other things. Let me add this, and this we'll see in Pisano's piece as well, is faces and beards are going to look very classical. So they're going to look like the faces and beards and the hair that we saw in the Greek and the Roman times. So there's going to be some verism, verism, that we saw with the Romans, so super realism. And there's also going to be kind of the more classical, sensual-like gaze and look, and use of clustering of hair that we saw during the Roman and the Greek period. The figures are going to be bulky in weight as well. So if you look at the voluminous nature of some of the Greek figures that we saw in high and late and Hellenistic period, classical Greek, they were bulky. Thighs were bulky, the arms were bulky, they're muscular, so lots of volume to the body. That's going to start to come back in as well. So you can look at the overall pulpit and that's figure 14.2 of Pisano. And you can see all these things. There's the frieze up on top with a little clustering of columns in between each section of the frieze. It's all relief carving of biblical figures, but you can see that there's a buildup of clustering figures to give a sense of mathematical symmetry, all right, which is something that we saw in antiquity in the Byzantine period. And that went all the way back to the friezes that we saw even on the Parthenon in Greece, in ancient Greece. If you zoom in, you can see that there's the drapery on the figures. A good example is figure 14.3. You can see the organic drapery, where the fold of the drapery over the head and over the body of the Annunciation and Nativity and Adoration of the Shepherds on figure 14.3 is being shown. So there is that organic drapery that's being developed. Again, I don't mean to keep going back and forth, but if you look at 14.2, you can see the Corinthian capital that is being held up by the rest of the column shaft. All right, so the Corinthian pillars have come back. The arcade is also seen in 14.2, where you have the three pointed or the two pointed half circles that are within the sprung barrel arch of each arcade that's going around in sections all the way around, full circle. So the arcade is there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I believe. I believe this is five-sided. And so there are 5 arches that are made up these pointed semicircular designs within the barrel arch that go around 5 times. Okay, so that's the arcade. It is a barrel vault system. It is a barrel archway creating the arcade. All right, they have the points inside that point down that give 3 like a clover design, but the overall arch is actually a barrel arch. And the frieze on top, which we talked about with figure 14.3, is evidently present. The faces and beards of the figures, the hair of the figures are all very classical Greek and Roman. All the way back to Greek, really, more than anything. And the figures are kind of bulky, and that's, again, something that's very Greco-Roman. So we're seeing the emotional display, but we're starting to see some of that equiposed emotionlessness, as well as kind of like serenity in the face that we saw with the tilt of the head, and also the eyes and the mouth being smooth and less aggravated. Which is something that's going to become very prevalent in the Renaissance. So this is a good transitional piece in regards to where we're coming out of with the medieval times of these distortions and these kind of emotional distortions, or distortions based off of emotions to connect to biblical tales, versus now it's more about rationalism and humanism to connect to these biblical tales. All right. Now, and there's another piece from the pulpit 14.4 where you can see the same clustering of figures to show a sense of depth and environment and such, just as another example. Now with painting, let me see how we're doing. I may chop up this chapter into a couple. Yeah, it looks like I'm going to have to. With painting, during this Duecento time, again 13th century, 1200 to 1299 CE, the painting is going to be very much a Byzantine style. And the reason for that, if you recall, whenever we talked about Byzantinum art in chapter 9, I believe, it's because a lot of the icon painters are what were called the iconophiles, Iconphiles. They moved west because they were casted out by the iconoclast. All right, so that's Iconklasts. So the iconoclasts didn't want, during that period of time for a couple hundred years, any paintings depicting divinity. So they casted the iconophiles out, who were making the paintings and icon paintings to have available in everyone's home, so that they can worship within their home if they couldn't get to the cathedral or the church or the temple or whatnot. So they all moved west. So that migrating style came after the fall of Constantinople, in particular, around 1204. So they were already migrating to the west and to these parts of Italy, and they were appreciated and embraced and asked to develop their art. But even more so in 1204 CE, when Constantinople, which remember was the new Rome, fell. And that's when Constantine moved the epicenter of Roman activity to the east, close to Jerusalem, in what is present day Istanbul, which was Constantinople. So they fled to Italy to increase this proto Renaissance style. So they have a lot to do in regards to paintings to this development of more observation and naturalistic observation of the world around them and incorporating that into new artistic styles after or at the end of this medieval period and into the Renaissance period. So we're going to look at, in particular, Cimabu's Madonna enthroned with angels and prophets. Again, there is so much to look at in regards to this information, and it would take a whole semester just to go over these few chapters. There's so much information. So Madonna enthroned with angels and prophets it challenged the medieval conventions to give more presence of the natural world. So how he's doing that is by looking at naturalistic traditions. So that is actually showing architecture. So these figures within this space, they are clustered like we saw in the medieval period, and there's a sense of symmetry with the amount of angels on both sides of the Madonna with child, which is something that was very Byzantinum, which was something very late antiquity, something very medieval. All right. But there's an emphasis on point of perspective, architectural perspective in particular. And you can see that the angles are going back towards the Madonna or the mother figure of Jesus or the child. So these are new advents that they're starting to pull. They're not new advents. They're in reinventions of the perspective that was of interest in regards to the Greek and the Romans. So this is starting to come back, and it's called a naturalistic tradition. So to look at something as if you're looking at a painting as if your eyes were the ones looking at the painting, not spiritual eyes, but material eyes. So those techniques are going to start to come back, and also the draping. There are going to be some elements that are very still medieval or post Byzantine. And those are the use of the gold background, which is an ethereal or a divine kind of background, getting a sense of divinity, which we already talked about. Gold and purple are a regal kind of divine-like use of coloration to show, higher echelon importance that we saw all the way back in the mosaics of Justinian, in San Vitale and also in Hagia Sophia. Then there's the use of model drapery. So again, the drapery is not to show a depiction of what the body and its animation looks like under the drapery and activates the drapery. That's organic drapery. This is modeled drapery. It's designed in a way to create lines to move your eye throughout the space like a mathematical formula, like geometry, using geometric lineation and modeling of the drapery to give movement throughout the piece. Then there's the symmetry that I talked about with the use of the angels. Again, this is figure 14.6, Madonna enthroned with angels and prophets. The bodies have elongations, which are abstractions, and that again is something that was used during this Byzantine and medieval period, giving a sense of abstraction, elongation, more of an emphasis on emotional bodily placement and not so much about actual realistic bodily placement of different appendages and such. Like you can see, her neck is elongated, her arms elongated. If she stood up, she would be 5 times bigger than the angels. Again, a sense of abstraction and found in the proportion of the body. It's disproportionate. What is not Byzantine, which is going to be more into the Renaissance, is again, I discussed deeper space, more depth, using perspective of the angles of the throne in which she's sitting on, the architecture of the barrel vaults that you see down low, with the prophets showing an emphasis on some slight dimensionality, though it's very, very minuscule. It's still flat. There's still some depth in the throne in which she's sitting on. And then also a little bit more organic drapery, just a little bit, like in the regular or in the prophets and in the angels, but not so much in her drapery. Okay, so it's modeled and organic. So they're slowly moving away from this flat modeled representation of fabric and moving more into organic, realistic fabric on what the body looks like or what the body is doing to the actual drapery that's on top of it. Okay, I'll leave you at that, and then we'll get into the Trecento, the 14th century, in the next video.